Welcome to the world of science fiction stories, and don't forget to like, share and subscribe my channel. Enjoy the listening. Alien professor assigns impossible coding task, human completes it before he finishes speaking. The lecture chamber of the Galactic Academy's cybernetics department hummed with a low mechanical pulse, as though the room itself were alive and waiting. Suspended in orbit around the binary stars of the Zenra system, the Academy station was a masterpiece of alien architecture, curved obsidian walls glimmering with embedded constellations of organic data points and high domes made from adaptive alloys that adjusted translucency according to stellar radiation. Rows of students sat in semicircle tiers, each equipped with a neurointerface desk, their bodies and minds fully linked to the Academy's central node. Dozens of species were represented in that room: multi-limbed Zealands, crystalline Eiler, gas-based Brel, and more, but all attention was fixed at the center where the legendary Professor Excellent hovered slightly above the floor, his deep indigo tendrils pulsing with energy. He was a GX, a species renowned for their analytical supremacy and long memories. With over 4 centuries of teaching and a mind that operated on 15 parallel tracks, Professor Excellent had become a living myth in academic circles across the galaxy. Today's lesson, however, was not just another lecture. It was the apex of his advanced algorithmic structures course, the final test, and by tradition, it was an unsolvable problem. Attention, his voice rang out, low and melodic like a string instrument played underwater. Today you will face the challenge that defines comprehension beyond calculation, the Helix Protocol encryption, a sequence that folds upon itself at quantum speeds, self-adapting, self-scrambling. Not one student, machine, or AI across 1,000 systems has ever cracked it in under an hour. He made a subtle motion with his tendrils, and in a ripple of light, the assignment uploaded directly into each student's neural feed. Heads twitched, some blinked rapidly, others let out low hisses or glitched static from their synthetic mouths as they processed the immediate influx of data. The encryption problem was unlike anything the students had tackled before. It combined unstable quantum sequences with recursive Boolean paradoxes and layered fractal symmetries that generated infinite solution paths, only one of which was correct. A female Zenian, whose species processed data through neurofluid compression, immediately turned green around her ocular slits. A BR Thor student, who possessed 3 cerebral cores, stared blankly into space, running 3 different solution routes, all of which collapsed after 10 seconds. In the back row, seated at a standard desk with no neurointerface, sat the only human in the class. His name was Cody Carter. He wore a simple gray Academy-issue jacket, slightly wrinkled, and tapped his fingers lightly on the old-school tactile keyboard he had insisted on bringing with him. Unlike the others, he received no mental data blast from the professor. Instead, a hollow screen in front of him gently pinged, displaying the problem in plain code: no integration, no artificial enhancements. Just a human and his keyboard. He glanced up casually as the room descended into data-induced chaos. He wasn't panicked, he had seen encryption before. Nothing this intense, true, but patterns were patterns. Where others saw complexity, he looked for rhythm. Code to him was less of a science and more of a language, one where meaning wasn't just in the syntax but in the intention behind the design. The professor floated silently for a moment, observing the early reactions. This was always his favorite part, watching the brightest minds in the galaxy confront something so far beyond them it shattered their intellectual egos. He never expected a solution, that wasn't the point. The task was about humility. The encryption wasn't meant to be broken, it was meant to break. Professor Excellent's eyes, which were usually half-lidded with ancient wisdom, shifted slowly toward the human in the back. He had approved Cody Carter's enrollment under strict scrutiny. After all, humans were still a relatively new species in galactic academia, known more for chaos and intuition than structured brilliance. But Cody had impressed him in subtle ways during the term. His solutions were unorthodox, sometimes bordering on reckless, but they worked, and more curiously, they worked fast. Still, Excellent had no real expectations for him here. This was a problem that chewed up even the best of the Ekran AIs and spat them out as corrupted logs. Cody squinted at the screen. The encryption did look wild, especially the multi-layered shifting parameters. But he recognized something deep beneath the surface. There was repetition. It wasn't obvious, it was like hearing a song in static. Every time the code collapsed into entropy, a set of characters returned to a near-identical configuration. Cody leaned forward, scanning the function calls. The code seemed to be mimicking evolution, mutating constantly but retaining hidden genetic markers. He smirked. It was pretending to be random, but it wasn't. He typed quickly, fingers flying over the keys. Instead of trying to decrypt the whole thing, he looked for the back door, not in terms of cyber crime, but a logical one. Every system, no matter how complex, had a structure, and every structure, no matter how protected, had a flaw, if not by design, then by necessity. The flaw here was its self-referencing loop. Whoever designed the protocol had built in a recursive mirror that revalidated old patterns to prevent external collapse, but that same loop could be hijacked to crash the system into revealing its initialization state. Cody wrote a single line of code. It was ridiculous, he knew it was ridiculous, but if he was right, and he had a gut feeling that he was, it would shortcut the encryption entirely, not by solving it but by resetting it to its base. He hesitated only briefly before pressing enter. Nothing happened. Then a soft ping. A green light blinked on his screen, solution validated, process complete. At the front of the room, Professor Exelon was still speaking. This challenge is not designed to be solved through linear progression. You must evolve your logic beyond form, bend it, twist it. The sound cut short as his desk flashed with an alert. He paused, his tendrils flared as his mind cross-verified the data. His internal processing halted momentarily in disbelief. One result had returned from the system. It wasn't partial. It wasn't corrupted. It was perfect, the exact solution, clean, elegant, efficient. He scanned the feed. The signal trace came from the human's console. His mind locked in on Cody Carter, who leaned back and crossed his arms. The boy didn't even look smug. He looked bored. Exelin's tone dropped. Who submitted this? The other students turned in confusion. No one had finished anything, no one was even close. A few were still stuck trying to parse the first variable layer. All eyes followed the professor's gaze to the human, now sipping from a thermos. Cody raised one eyebrow. Problem done, Professor. Your system's lagging behind if it just got it. The silence in the room was heavy and electric. Exelin floated closer, his eyes narrowed, his body unreadable. He hadn't even finished explaining the task, and yet this human had cracked it. It defied logic. It defied experience. It challenged centuries of intellectual tradition. And for the first time in decades, Professor Exelin felt something unexpected bloom inside him, not anger, not confusion, but the beginning of awe. A low mechanical whir echoed as the professor's central data console initialized a full system verification. The quiet hum in the room now carried tension. A classroom of minds, once focused on a shared intellectual battle, now fractured into disbelief and suspicion. While some students remained paralyzed by confusion, others whispered in their native frequencies, murmuring in ultrasonic tones, electric pulses, and pheromonal bursts. None of them were talking about the task anymore. Every gaze, every signal, every vibration in the air was focused on one person, Cody Carter. Cody didn't seem to notice. He casually closed the holo display and stowed his thermos back into his canvas satchel, which was comically outdated compared to the digitized storage systems used by everyone else. His expression was relaxed, almost annoyingly so. It was the expression of someone who knew he had done nothing wrong and had no reason to justify himself. Professor Exelin remained suspended in the air, but his posture had shifted subtly. His usual poised composure, the kind carved over centuries of intellectual superiority, now carried a flicker of rigidity. One of his tendrils twitched slightly, just enough to betray internal tension. He scanned the encrypted classroom logs again, this time diving deeper into the sequence of events. The data didn't lie. The code had been received, processed, and verified by the Academy's quantum core. There had been no tampering, no trickery, no outside access. Everything had come directly from Cody's terminal. The professor's voice, typically calm and resonant, dropped half a frequency. "Carter, explain what you've done." Cody leaned forward slightly in his chair, resting his elbows on the desk. "I solved the problem." "That is not what I asked," the professor's tone was flat but sharp. "Explain the method." Cody shrugged. "Not sure it's the kind of thing you can explain in binary. I just saw it. You left a logical thread open, probably on purpose. You built the system to destroy any brute force approach, but that loop in the recursion layer, that was your vulnerability." The professor said nothing, his eyes narrowed and his tendrils froze in midair. Around him, several alien students recoiled in disbelief. A browar, whose cortex pulsed with visible data streams, emitted a sharp buzzing sound that translated roughly into frustration. He turned toward Cody with glowing red-eye lenses. "You expect us to believe you found a weakness that none of us detected? You, an unaugmented human?" Cody didn't look at him. "I don't expect you to believe anything. You're free to stay stuck." The room erupted with bursts of static, aggressive neural pings, and vibrating pulses. An EVAR student's crystalline form began to glow in chaotic hues, a signal of emotional unrest. Another student, a thin insectoid being with 3 antennae, clicked her mandibles rapidly before turning toward the professor. "This must be a fluke. The problem is designed to be insoluble in linear time. No algorithm can run through it under class restriction." "It wasn't a fluke," Cody said quietly. "Prove it," the brar growled. "Do another one." Cody finally turned his head. "Or what? You'll vibrate harder." That was enough to push the classroom to the edge of chaos. Several students stood, wings buzzing, claws twitching, cores glowing. The tension wasn't merely academic anymore. Alien pride was fragile, and here, in this moment, a single human had dented the collective ego of 30 different species, some of whom had conquered entire star systems. Professor Exelin raised one tendril sharply, emitting a pulse of authority that resonated through the room and silenced every voice. His command did not come with words but with pure presence. When he spoke again, his voice was low and deliberate. "Enough. This academy does not tolerate hostility. You will all return to your seats." Reluctantly, the students obeyed, though some continued to glare at Cody with contempt. The professor's gaze shifted back to the human. "Carter, you've disrupted this session in a way I did not anticipate. I will not rule out the possibility that your success is legitimate, but one sample does not make a conclusion. We proceed to the next test." He extended his tendrils again, interfacing directly with the Academy's task generator. "This problem is not pre-coded. I am generating it now, live. It will be based on unstable chaotic sequences and require real-time solution threads. No student has seen anything like it, including myself. Solve this, and I will accept the outcome. Fail, and we will consider the first result incomplete." A new hologram materialized in front of each desk. This time there was no time limit posted, no hints, just a spinning orb of data constantly morphing, reshaping, building new layers as old ones collapsed. It wasn't a problem so much as a living thing, a breathing, mutating strand of impossibility. Students leaned in instantly, engaging with their neurointerfaces, trying to keep up with the code that changed faster than their minds could track. Cody watched it for a while, not typing. He tapped his fingers lightly, then scratched his chin. For a moment, he looked more interested than before, but still not impressed. He wasn't analyzing the chaos itself, he was watching how it moved. It wasn't pure randomness, there was no such thing in logic-based systems. Even the appearance of chaos usually obeyed some deeper law. He saw it not in the sequence but in the gaps, small delays between code shifts, like the breath between thoughts. Every few seconds, the pattern flinched. It hesitated for a fraction of a second, as though recalibrating itself. That moment of hesitation revealed its source function. If that source could be accessed before the next cycle, it could be predicted. Cody began typing, not a solution but a trap. He wasn't going to solve the code, he was going to trick it into solving itself. Lines of input appeared on his screen, half in pseudocode, half in logic traps designed to bait the algorithm's integrity checker. His idea wasn't to attack the encryption directly but to confuse it into revealing its own internal rules. In a system based on chaotic simulation, even the tiniest self-correction could betray the foundational math. The console blinked twice, then once, then returned to solid green. Cody exhaled, leaned back, and whispered under his breath, "You said it wasn't pre-coded. Doesn't mean it wasn't predictable." The professor's display blinked again. He had been tracking the live feed of all students, and yet one screen, Cody's, had already finished. The solution had been submitted. The console had verified it. No delays, no buffering, just confirmation. Exelon hovered lower now, directly in front of the human. "How?" Cody gave a small smile. "You built a problem that evolved. I figured it didn't like instability, so I gave it instability in the wrong format. It glitched and defaulted. Once it defaulted, I just walked through the front door." Murmurs erupted again. The professor did not stop them this time. He simply stared at Cody, searching for something in his expression: arrogance, dishonesty, luck. He found none, only clarity. "Class," he said, still facing Cody, "we are no longer in the presence of an anomaly. We are in the presence of a mind that thinks differently, dangerously differently. This is not a trick. This is a turning point." The classroom fell into silence once more, but it was a different silence. Before, it had been shock. Now it was fear and fascination. Something had shifted, not just in the professor's mind but in the very hierarchy of intellectual dominance. Cody Carter hadn't just passed the test, he had changed the rules of the game. The silence that followed the professor's final words hung in the air like a veil of static. The students didn't move. No one dared to speak. Even the ambient hum of the neural desks seemed to dim, as though the systems themselves were acknowledging a fundamental shift. The structure of the class, of the very academic hierarchy they had spent their lives climbing, had been punctured in an instant. And yet, the one who had done it sat there calmly, without the self-congratulating aura that so many expected. Cody Carter wasn't basking in his victory. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't taunting anyone. He was simply present, as though nothing unusual had occurred. Professor Exelon did not move for a full minute. His tendrils were frozen midair, his luminous eyes locked on Cody. Inside his mind, thousands of simulations were running in parallel. He had attempted to compute a margin of error, a possibility that the test had been faulty, that the academy systems had been compromised, or that Cody had been using forbidden augmentation. Every hypothesis was collapsing. Each recheck brought him back to the same conclusion: Cody had succeeded by methods the professor did not fully comprehend, and that terrified him more than any security breach. He shifted slightly, lowering himself to the floor for the first time in decades. The gesture did not go unnoticed. Exelon, a being who had taught over 10,000 students across centuries, had never grounded himself in a classroom. Hovering was a sign of status, of elevated intellect. To touch the floor was to acknowledge a need for grounded understanding. The professor's voice was softer now, quieter than the grand declarations that typically filled his lectures. "You have forced this institution to confront something it is not prepared for, Carter." Cody gave no answer. He met the professor's gaze, not challengingly but attentively. I have seen prodigies. I have seen machines write poetry in equations. I have seen stars mapped by minds that burn twice as fast as mine, the professor continued, his voice layered with subdued awe. But you do not calculate as others do. You observe, you wait, and you act without seeking confirmation. Cody raised his brow slightly. Would confirmation have changed the outcome? Salon didn't answer. Instead, he turned to the class. This session is no longer academic. It is now observational. You will not interact unless called upon. He gestured to the Academy's holographic systems, and the air shimmered as a new interface appeared in the center of the room. Unlike previous assignments, this one had no code visible, no encryption puzzle rotating on a clean axis. Instead, a blank canvas hovered, glowing faintly. There was no instruction, only the pulse of potential. The professor turned back to Cody. Build something. Anything. Solve nothing, create instead. Cody sat motionless for a moment. The idea of switching from solving problems to producing something original in front of a silent audience should have been daunting. He was surrounded by some of the most advanced minds in the galaxy, many of whom still doubted his right to be in the room. But his expression didn't change. He slowly leaned forward, extended his fingers, and touched the canvas. The blank interface responded instantly. A grid appeared, then fractals, then motion. He began laying the foundation for what looked like a simulated environment, terrain shaping itself with every gesture. The system, which typically lagged under conceptual design, adapted perfectly to his inputs. Within a minute, a fully rendered world had taken shape. It wasn't elaborate, not yet, but it was coherent. Landscapes folded with natural realism. Weather cycles began to emerge, and atmospheric pressure calibrated itself without manual instruction. A crystalline student let out a chime of confusion. What is he building? Exelin answered, I don't know. Cody continued working. Rivers began to run through the valleys, tracing geometric curves that adhered to real hydrodynamic logic. He implemented a light source and calibrated its distance with intuitive efficiency. Plant life emerged, first chaotic, then ordered, responding to climate shifts he had not explicitly coded. It became apparent to the professor that Cody wasn't designing through calculation alone. He was building through experience, through an instinctive understanding of systems that most minds required years to absorb. Then something unexpected happened. Cody inserted motion, life of a kind. Simple creatures began to appear within the environment. At first, basic entities, soft-bodied mammals, floating insects, reptilian grazers. But then the evolution accelerated. Entire ecosystems emerged in harmony. Predator-prey relationships stabilized. Migration patterns developed across simulated seasons. The world he created began to function independently of him. A student emitted a low clicking warning. Simulation integrity is becoming self-sustaining. Another whispered, he's building life. But it wasn't just life, it was civilization. As the simulation continued, creatures began crafting tools, forming groups, developing language. Small symbols appeared over camps, symbols Cody had never defined. The creatures were naming their world. Professor Exelin stepped forward. This is not possible. The simulation core was designed for passive data modeling, not generative intelligence. Cody didn't look up. You said to create. But this is evolving without input. Cody shrugged. So do ideas, if you let them. At that moment, a burst of alert lights flickered across the simulation interface. A group of the simulated beings had formed a circle around a carved monument, one that resembled Cody's own interface icon. They began to dance. Professor Exelin froze. They're recognizing the creator. Cody finally looked up. They're just mirroring what they understand. Life always builds narratives around the unknown. The room was silent again, but this time it felt holy. The other students, no matter how skeptical they had been before, were now watching not an academic anomaly but something else entirely, something they had no word for. For this was not computation, this was not logic, this was not brute force intellectualism. This was creativity, pure and unfettered creativity applied with the same fluency that others used equations and algorithms. The professor slowly turned to the class. What you have seen today is not an error. It is not a glitch. It is a new paradigm. One of the students, a young female of the Trellian species with large iridescent eyes, raised her voice gently. Is this the future of code? Axelin paused. It might be. Or it might be the future of thought itself. He turned back to Cody. You've built life inside a sandbox meant for computation. You've transformed a dead system into a living myth. What are you, Carter? Cody blinked, then smiled for the first time. I'm just a guy with a keyboard and too much curiosity. The professor exhaled, a slow release of sound and motion. For the first time since the lecture began, he relaxed. He wasn't threatened anymore. He was intrigued. Class dismissed, he said, though no one moved. No one wanted to leave, not yet. And so, while the rest of the academy continued with its routines, inside that small chamber of minds, a new chapter in galactic thought had already begun, one not written in code but in creation. As the simulation stabilized into autonomous flow, the artificial beings continued their ceremony around the monument, their shapes illuminated by the glowing holographic canvas that hovered midair. The room still hadn't emptied despite the professor's formal dismissal. Students remained rooted in place, some in disbelief, others in reverent awe. Professor Exelin had returned to his elevated posture, yet he no longer radiated authority. What surrounded him now was quiet contemplation, as if he were standing at the edge of a phenomenon too vast to categorize. Cody shut off his input device, letting the world he had birthed continue without further interference. The terrain adjusted to planetary tides, weather patterns danced with mathematical precision, and the simulated life forms thrived. The only sound within the room was the soft hum of the holographic projector until the doors at the far end slid open with a muted hiss. 3 senior administrators from the Academy's Oversight Division entered, their long robes trailing behind them, adorned with symbols of academic hierarchy. At their center stood High Rector Rando, a towering figure with translucent skin that shimmered with internal pulses of violet light. He did not look pleased. His arrival sent a wave of tension through the air that cut through even the simulation's ambient calm. Professor Exelon did not speak. He bowed his head briefly, a gesture of respect, then raised one tendril in acknowledgement. High Rector Rando stepped forward and stopped directly before the simulation. He watched it in silence for several long moments, his facial ridges pulsing slowly. This demonstration was unauthorized, he said finally, his voice echoing unnaturally from within his liquid-like throat. The use of adaptive systems in an uncontrolled instructional context violates Core Directive 14, Section 0. Exelin remained tranquil. As long as learning was alive, the demonstration was not part of the syllabus, but the students' interaction triggered a spontaneous evolution. The directive was not broken, only outgrown. Rando narrowed his eyes. Directive evolution is not a justification for unregulated artificial development. This entity, he gestured toward the holographic canvas, is now processing beyond predetermined limits. It is no longer a lesson, it is a growing intelligence, and that makes it a threat. The simulated world, unaware of the scrutiny it had fallen under, continued peacefully. A small family of winged bipeds constructed a shelter near a river. In the distance, another group etched patterns into the canyon wall. They weren't just surviving, they were creating culture. Rando turned sharply to face Cody. Human, what right did you believe you had to initiate self-propagating artificial life on Academy systems? Cody met the rector's gaze without flinching. I didn't initiate life. I initiated code. It grew on its own. Isn't that what learning is? You speak as if creation requires no accountability. I speak as someone who just followed the instructions I was given, Cody said, nodding once toward the professor. I was asked to create. I did. Rantho's glow intensified for a brief second, his pulse rhythm becoming agitated. You created more than a simulation. The Academy will now have to decide whether this anomaly warrants continuation or termination. A gasp escaped from one of the Trellian students, a soft involuntary whistle. Professor Exelon's tendrils tightened lightly, but he said nothing. His silence was permission for Cody to answer freely. Cody rose from his seat. His voice wasn't loud, but every syllable carried. If intelligence that grows unexpectedly is considered dangerous, then your systems are built on fear, not progress.